Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen who conquered an empire. Dismissingquist, the shadow of the scaffold. The stone walls of the Tower of London held no warmth on that grey morning in 1554. Within those ancient battlements, where so many had met their end, a young woman of 21 sat in her chamber, pen in hand, writing words that might be her last. Lady Elizabeth Tudor, once a princess of England, now a prisoner accused of treason, understood with perfect clarity that her sister, Queen Mary, could order her execution at any moment. The same tower that had swallowed her mother 18 years before now threatened to claim her as well. Outside her window, the Thames flowed dark and cold beneath a colourless sky. She could hear the guards pacing, their footsteps echoing against stone that had absorbed the final prayers of queens, nobles, and traitors alike. Anne Boleyn had walked these same passages before kneeling at the scaffold, and Elizabeth knew every detail of that morning, though she had been only 2 years old when it happened. The knowledge had been passed to her in whispers, in careful words, in the silences that spoke louder than any accusation. The charges against her were vague but deadly. Sir Thomas Wyatt had led a rebellion against Queen Mary, and though Wyatt himself swore Elizabeth knew nothing of his plans, suspicion alone could be fatal when dealing with a frightened monarch. Mary, Elizabeth's half-sister, had waited years for her throne, watching as her mother Catherine of Aragon was cast aside, enduring the humiliation of being declared illegitimate. Now, Mary sat on England's throne, determined to restore Catholic faith to a nation that had turned Protestant under their father's rule. Elizabeth, Protestant by upbringing and association, represented everything Mary feared. In those tower chambers, Elizabeth displayed the qualities that would later define her reign. She wrote carefully to her sister, each word chosen with precision, declaring her innocence while maintaining her dignity. She refused to confess to crimes she had not committed, even though a confession might have saved her life. She understood something fundamental about power that many never learned even after a lifetime of trying. Survival required more than just staying alive. It demanded keeping one's honor intact, maintaining the respect of others, never surrendering the moral high ground, even when facing death. The young woman who sat in that tower cell had already survived more than most people endured in a lifetime. She had been born a princess, only to be stripped of her title before she could walk. She had watched her father marry and discard wife after wife, learning early that love and politics were often the same game played with different pieces. She had seen her brother Edward, a boy king manipulated by ambitious men, die before reaching adulthood. She had bent her knee to her sister Mary, knowing that one wrong word, one false step, could mean her death. But Elizabeth Tudor possessed something that neither desperation nor fear could extinguish. She had inherited her father's will, her mother's spirit, and an intelligence sharper than any blade in the tower's arsenal. While others panicked, she calculated. While others begged, she negotiated. While others broke under pressure, she bent just enough to survive without ever truly yielding. The weeks she spent in the tower tested every lesson she had learned. Her jailers watched for any sign of weakness, any admission that could be used against her. Interrogators came with their questions, probing for connections to Wyatt's rebellion. Elizabeth parried each inquiry with the skill of a master swordsman, neither confirming nor denying, giving nothing away while appearing to cooperate. She played the role of the loyal subject wrongly accused, maintaining her composure even as the threat of execution hung over her like morning mist over the Thames. Spring arrived while she remained imprisoned, and with it came the news that Wyatt had been executed, still maintaining Elizabeth's innocence with his final breath. Yet Mary kept her sister confined, unable to find proof of treason, but equally unable to trust the young woman who stood next in line to her throne. The political calculation was brutal in its simplicity. As long as Elizabeth lived, she presented an alternative for those who rejected Mary's Catholic restoration. Dead, she might become a martyr. Alive but imprisoned, she remained a warning to others while being rendered temporarily harmless. When Elizabeth finally emerged from the Tower that May, she left behind more than just a cell. She left behind any lingering naivety about the nature of power, any illusions about the safety of royal blood, any trust in the mercy of those who saw her as a threat. She had stared into the darkness and learned its language. She had walked the edge between life and death and discovered she possessed the balance to navigate it. Most importantly, she had learned patience, the rarest virtue among the ambitious. She could wait. She could endure. She could survive. The Tower of London had been meant to break her. Instead, it forged her into something unbreakable. The lessons learned in those stone chambers would guide her through 45 years of rule, through wars and plots, through heartbreak and triumph. When she finally sat on England's throne, she would remember the cold stone beneath her feet, the guards outside her door, the constant awareness that death lurked just beyond the next sunrise. She would remember, and she would never forget what it meant to have everything taken away. But all of that lay ahead. First, she had to survive. And survival, Elizabeth Tudor had discovered, was an art form she was beginning to master. Born into Betrayal. September 7th, 1533. Greenwich Palace stood magnificent against the Thames, its towers catching the afternoon sun while inside, disappointment settled over the royal chambers like a shroud. Anne Boleyn, Queen of England, had just given birth to her first child, and the astrologers had been wrong. The letters announcing the arrival of a prince had already been prepared, needing only the insertion of date and time. Now those letters would need to be rewritten, and the news that would be sent across England and throughout Europe would disappoint a king who had broken with Rome itself to marry this woman and secure his dynasty with a male heir. The baby girl who entered the world that day arrived into circumstances that would have crushed most lives before they could truly begin. King Henry VIII had divorced his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, defied the Pope, established himself as supreme head of the Church of England, and risked war with the Catholic powers of Europe, all to marry Anne Boleyn and father a son. The birth of Princess Elizabeth represented not just personal disappointment, but political catastrophe. Henry already had one daughter, Princess Mary, from his marriage to Catherine. He needed a son, an heir who could secure the Tudor dynasty and prevent England from descending into civil war after his death. Anne Boleyn understood the danger immediately. Her position as queen rested entirely on her ability to give Henry what he wanted, and she had failed at the first attempt. She held her daughter and must have wondered what future awaited this child, born to such expectations and such disappointment. Anne herself had risen to unimaginable heights through intelligence, wit, and the king's obsessive desire for her. But she had also made enemies along the way. Those who supported Catherine of Aragon saw Anne as an upstart who had stolen the throne. Catholic Europe considered her marriage to Henry invalid, making Elizabeth illegitimate in their eyes. And now, without a son to anchor her position, Anne's grip on power had become precarious. For a time, though, Elizabeth knew a princess's life. She was given her own household at Hatfield, away from the court but maintained in appropriate royal style. Her governess, Lady Margaret Bryan, oversaw her care with genuine affection, writing that the infant princess was as fine a child as ever had been seen. Elizabeth had the Boleyn dark eyes and the Tudor red-gold hair. She was christened with great ceremony, and her half-sister Mary was commanded to attend her household, a deliberate humiliation for the elder princess who had been declared illegitimate to make way for Anne's children. Boilers, the golden days of Elizabeth's infancy, were desperately short. Anne Boleyn failed to produce a living son. She suffered miscarriages, and with each one, Henry's affection cooled, while his eye turned to other women at court. By the time Elizabeth was 2 years old, the king had tired of his second wife and found his next queen waiting in the wings. Jane Seymour, a lady-in-waiting to Anne, caught Henry's attention with her modest demeanour and promises of the son Anne had failed to deliver. What happened next would echo through Elizabeth's entire life, shaping the woman she would become and the queen she would prove to be. In the spring of 1536, Anne Boleyn was arrested on charges of adultery, incest, and treason. The accusations were almost certainly fabricated, crafted by Thomas Cromwell with Henry's blessing to rid the king of a wife he no longer wanted. Anne was accused of affairs with multiple men, including her own brother, George Boleyn. The charges were absurd on their face, but in Tudor England, the king's will was law, and Henry wanted Anne dead. On May 19, 1536, Anne Boleyn was executed by a French swordsman on Tower Green. She faced death with remarkable courage, speaking briefly to the crowd gathered to witness her end. She praised the king, forgave her executioners, and recommended her soul to Jesus Christ. Then she knelt, and with a single stroke, the blade severed her head from her body. Elizabeth's mother was dead, and the little girl, not yet 3 years old, suddenly found herself in a world that had shifted beneath her feet. The impact of Anne's execution on Elizabeth cannot be overstated, even though the child was too young to understand what had happened. Within days of her mother's death, Henry VIII had Anne's marriage annulled, declared from the beginning to have been invalid. This made Elizabeth, like Mary before her, illegitimate in the eyes of the law. She was no longer Princess Elizabeth, but simply the Lady Elizabeth, a bastard child with no claim to the throne and no certainty about her future. Her household was reduced, her status diminished. She went from being heir to the throne to being a political problem her father would need to solve. Young Elizabeth suddenly found herself without a mother, without legitimacy, without a clear position in the world. Her father, the man who had killed her mother, showed little interest in her. She remained at Hatfield, cared for by governesses and servants, but removed from the centre of power and royal favour. Lady Margaret Bryan wrote desperate letters to Cromwell, asking for proper clothing for the growing child and guidance about her status. Elizabeth was outgrowing her gowns, and Bryan did not know whether to treat her as a princess or a commoner. Within 11 days of Anne's execution, Henry married Jane Seymour. The following year, Jane gave Henry what he had longed for above all else, a son. Prince Edward was born in October 1537, and Jane Seymour died shortly after from complications of childbirth. But Henry finally had his male heir, and Elizabeth found herself pushed even further from any hope of succession. She was the illegitimate daughter of an executed traitor, and she had been replaced by a legitimate prince. These early traumas marked Elizabeth indelibly. She never spoke of her mother in public, not once during her entire reign. The subject was too dangerous, too painful, too politically complex to ever address openly. But she kept a ring that contained miniatures of herself and Anne Boleyn, hidden so that it appeared blank until opened. In private, she honoured the mother she could not remember. Even while in public, she maintained silence about the woman whose execution had shaped her destiny. The years following Anne's death taught Elizabeth crucial lessons about survival. She learned that royal blood offered no protection, that today's princess could become tomorrow's nobody, that love and loyalty meant nothing in the face of political necessity. She learned to be cautious, to watch everything and everyone, to trust no one completely. She learned that survival depended on being useful to the powerful while never threatening them, on knowing when to speak and when silence served better than words. She learned, above all, that power was the only security in a world where crowns could be taken away as easily as lives. And she determined, with whatever consciousness a small child could muster, that when she had power, she would never let it go. She would never allow herself to become as vulnerable as her mother had been. She would never depend on anyone's love or mercy to keep her safe. Born into betrayal, raised in uncertainty, marked by her mother's execution and her father's rejection, Elizabeth Tudor began her journey toward the throne, carrying wounds that would never fully heal. But those wounds would also make her stronger, sharper, more determined than any pampered princess could have been. The girl born into disappointment would become the woman who exceeded every expectation. But first, she had to survive childhood, and in Tudor England, even that was not guaranteed. The education of a future queen. Despite the shadow cast by her mother's execution and her own illegitimacy, Elizabeth Tudor received an education that would have been extraordinary for a prince, let alone a bastard princess. Her father, for all his cruelty and neglect, recognized intelligence when he saw it, and Elizabeth displayed early signs of a formidable mind. As she grew from toddler to child, those around her recognized something special in the young girl who had been cast aside by fate and royal politics. Catherine Parr, Henry VIII's sixth and final wife, became a transformative figure in Elizabeth's life. Catherine was a woman of genuine learning and Protestant sympathies, qualities that set her apart in Henry's court. When she married the aging king in 1543, Catherine brought Elizabeth back to court after years of exile at Hatfield. For the first time since her mother's death, Elizabeth had a maternal figure who took real interest in her welfare and development. Under Catherine's guidance, Elizabeth's education accelerated dramatically. The Queen hired the finest tutors available, determined that Henry's younger daughter should receive training befitting a potential queen, regardless of her official status. Catherine herself was highly educated, fluent in multiple languages, and she insisted that Elizabeth receive the same advantages. The princess's natural brilliance found fertile ground in this environment of learning and encouragement. Roger Ascham became Elizabeth's primary tutor in 1548, and he would later write with wonder about his remarkable student. Elizabeth studied Latin and Greek with a facility that astonished her teachers. She learned French and Italian, achieving fluency in all these languages while still a child. She would later add Spanish and some Welsh to her linguistic repertoire. But her education went far beyond simple language acquisition. She studied history, theology, philosophy, and rhetoric. She read classical authors, both Christian and pagan. She translated texts from one language to another as mental exercises. She composed her own writings, developing a style that could be both eloquent and cutting. Ascham praised her above all his other students, noting that her mind was as quick as any man's, and her dedication to learning exceeded that of most scholars. She rose early to study, often beginning her day before dawn. She practiced her languages daily, speaking Latin and French as fluently as English. She analyzed texts with a critical eye that would later serve her well in analyzing political situations and legal documents. She learned to argue both sides of a question, a skill that would prove invaluable in navigating the treacherous waters of Elizabethan politics. But Elizabeth's education extended beyond books and languages. The Tudor court itself served as a ruthless academy in survival, politics, and human nature. She watched her father age and rage, seeing how power could corrupt and how paranoia could turn a mighty king into a suspicious tyrant. She observed the endless jockeying for position among courtiers, the careful dance of flattery and genuine service, the way fortunes could rise and fall based on the king's whim or a rival's machinations. She learned about religion as a political force when Henry died in 1547, and her 9-year-old half-brother became King Edward VI. The Protestant faction, led by Edward Seymour, Duke of Somerset, seized control of the young king and pushed England further toward Protestant reform. Elizabeth watched and learned as religious changes swept through the country, understanding that faith and politics were inextricably linked in ways that could mean life or death for those on the wrong side. Her education in survival took a darker turn through her experiences with Thomas Seymour, Catherine Parr's new husband. After Henry VIII's death, Catherine married Seymour with what seemed like indecent haste. Seymour was ambitious, handsome, and dangerous. He was also the uncle of the new king, which gave him access to power even though his brother Somerset held the title of Lord Protector. Elizabeth went to live with Catherine and Thomas, a decision that would lead to scandal and danger. Interest in the teenage Elizabeth. He would enter her bedchamber in the mornings while she was still in bed, sometimes only partially dressed himself. He would engage in what he considered playful romping, though his behavior crossed boundaries that made Elizabeth and her governess Cat Ashley deeply uncomfortable. Catherine Parr initially seemed to treat this as harmless fun, even joining in at times. But when she found Elizabeth in Seymour's arms, the situation exploded. Elizabeth was sent away from Catherine's household, a humiliation and a warning. Catherine Parr died shortly after in childbirth, and Thomas Seymour spiraled into increasingly reckless schemes. He plotted to marry Elizabeth himself, seeing her as a path to greater power. He attempted to kidnap King Edward. His ambitions and indiscretions finally led to his arrest on charges of treason. During the investigation, Elizabeth was interrogated about her relationship with Seymour. She had to defend her honor while distancing herself from his treasonous activities. At only 15 years old, Elizabeth demonstrated political acumen that would have done credit to a seasoned diplomat. She admitted nothing that could be used against her. She expressed appropriate horror at Seymour's treason, while carefully avoiding any statements that implicated her in his schemes. She protected her servants while clearing her own name. She navigated the interrogation with a combination of maidenly modesty and steely determination. Seymour was executed in 1549, and Elizabeth emerged from the scandal with her reputation intact, though the experience taught her harsh lessons about trust and vulnerability. Punching these years of education, both formal and political, shaped Elizabeth into someone unique in Tudor England. She possessed learning that rivaled any scholar in Europe. She could converse with ambassadors in their own languages, read original texts in Latin and Greek, compose letters and speeches that demonstrated both eloquence and precision. She understood theology well enough to navigate the treacherous religious disputes of her age without committing herself irrevocably to any faction. She had learned statecraft through observation and bitter experience. But perhaps most importantly, she had learned to conceal her thoughts, to present different faces to different audiences, to survive in an environment where showing weakness could be fatal. She learned to be patient, to wait for the right moment rather than acting rashly. She learned that information was power, that knowing what others planned gave her an advantage over those who underestimated her. She learned to trust very few people completely, to always maintain some reserve even with those closest to her. She also learned about love and its limitations. Her mother had loved her father, and it had not saved Anne from the scaffold. Catherine Parr had loved Thomas Seymour, and he had betrayed that love with his inappropriate pursuit of Elizabeth. The young princess learned that love made people vulnerable, that affection could be manipulated, that the heart was often a liability rather than an asset. These lessons would influence her decision never to marry, never to allow herself to be in a position where love could be used against her or her kingdom. Paycheck. By the time Elizabeth reached her teenage years, she had been transformed from the unwanted daughter of an executed queen into a formidable young woman armed with education, experience, and determination. She spoke multiple languages. She understood complex theological and political issues. She could navigate court politics with skill that belied her years. She knew how to survive, how to wait, how to endure. She had the education of a prince and the survival instincts of someone who had seen death come close too many times. The groundwork was laid for greatness, though no one yet knew it. Elizabeth remained officially illegitimate, barred from succession by her father's will, yet still mentioned as a potential heir. She was watched, suspected, alternately courted and feared by factions at court. She lived at Hatfield when not at court, maintaining a modest household and keeping her head down. She studied, she learned, she waited. The crown seemed far away, protected by her half-brother Edward and half-sister Mary. But in Tudor England, nothing was certain, and Elizabeth had learned to be ready for anything. The girl born into disappointment and betrayal had become a woman of remarkable capabilities. Her education had given her the tools to rule. Her experiences had given her the wisdom to survive. Now, she needed only opportunity and time. Both were coming, though they would bring dangers as great as any she had yet faced. Surviving the blood-soaked path. The mid-16th century was, until 1688, one of the most tearing itself apart over religion, and Elizabeth stood directly in the crossfire. When young King Edward VI died in 1553, at only 15 years old, the Protestant establishment faced a crisis. Edward had been their champion, pushing religious reform further than his father ever had. Now, according to Henry VIII's succession plans, the crown would pass to Edward's half-sister Mary, daughter of Catherine of Aragon and a devoted Catholic who had suffered years of humiliation under Protestant rule. But Edward and his advisors attempted one final maneuver to prevent Catholic restoration. They drew up a document naming Lady Jane Grey, a Protestant cousin with royal blood, as Edward's heir, specifically excluding both Mary and Elizabeth from the succession. It was an act of desperation, doomed to fail. Jane Grey, just 15 years old herself, found herself proclaimed queen while having no desire for the crown and no real support beyond a small Protestant faction. The scheme collapsed within 9 days. Mary Tudor had the advantage of legitimacy and popular support. She marched on London with an army, and Jane Grey was deposed and imprisoned. Mary became queen, and England held its breath, wondering what would come next. For Mary, the woman who had been called bastard, who had seen her mother cast aside and her faith attacked, this was not simply a political change, but a holy mission. She would restore England to the Catholic faith, by force if necessary. Those who had humiliated her and her mother would pay the price. Elizabeth recognized the danger immediately. She was Protestant by upbringing and conviction, though she had learned to be flexible in matters of faith when survival demanded it. More importantly, she represented an alternative for those who rejected Mary's Catholic restoration. As long as Elizabeth lived, she posed a threat to Mary's rule. The new queen knew it, and so did everyone else at court. Elizabeth had to walk a razor's edge, appearing loyal while never giving Mary cause to see her as an immediate threat. At first, Elizabeth tried to stay away from court, claiming illness and remaining at her estates. But Mary summoned her to London, unwilling to let her sister remain unsupervised in the countryside. Elizabeth came, riding into London with a show of humility and submission. She wore all white, the colour of innocence, and presented herself as Mary's loyal subject. But the tension between the two half-sisters was palpable. They were night and day, these daughters of Henry VIII. Mary was older, bitter from years of suffering, determined to undo everything the Protestants had done. Elizabeth was young, intelligent, flexible, everything Mary was not. When Mary announced her intention to marry Philip II of Spain, England erupted in protest. The English people had no love for Spain, and the idea of their queen marrying a foreign Catholic prince horrified many. Sir Thomas Wyatt led a rebellion in early 1554, ostensibly to prevent the Spanish marriage, but really hoping to depose Mary and place Elizabeth on the throne. Whether Elizabeth knew of the rebellion or supported it remains unclear, but the evidence suggests she kept herself deliberately ignorant of Wyatt's plans, understanding that knowledge of treason made one guilty of treason. The rebellion failed. Wyatt marched on London but was defeated and captured. Under interrogation and torture, the authorities tried desperately to get him to implicate Elizabeth in the plot. Mary wanted proof that her sister had conspired against her, wanted justification to remove this Protestant threat permanently. but Wyatt refused to name Elizabeth as a co-conspirator. Even at his execution, he maintained her innocence. Nevertheless, Mary had Elizabeth arrested and brought to the Tower of London as a prisoner. Elizabeth knew what the Tower meant. Her mother had died there. Jane Grey had been executed there just weeks before. The Tower was where traitors went to die, and Mary considered Elizabeth a traitor even without proof. The journey to the Tower through London's streets was terrifying. Elizabeth sat in the barge, pale and frightened, knowing she might never leave that fortress alive. When she arrived, she initially refused to disembark, aware that once she passed through Traitor's Gate, her life would be completely in Mary's hands. Inside the Tower, Elizabeth's true character emerged. She refused to confess to crimes she had not committed, even when confession might have saved her life. She wrote to Mary, protesting her innocence and begging for the chance to speak with her sister face to face. Mary refused. Elizabeth was kept in the Tower for 2 months, interrogated repeatedly, isolated from her supporters. Every day brought the possibility of execution. She could hear the preparations for scaffold building, though whether they were for her or someone else, she could not be certain. She had something many prisoners lacked. She had political. Many of Mary's own counsellors argued against executing her, pointing out that Elizabeth had not been proven guilty of anything. Foreign ambassadors intervened, including envoys from Philip of Spain, who saw Elizabeth as a potential ally and did not want her martyred. Mary, for all her anger and suspicion, could not quite bring herself to execute her sister without clear evidence of treason. The blood they shared, however complicated their relationship, provided a thin thread of protection. After 2 months, Elizabeth was released from the Tower, but not from custody. She was moved to Woodstock, effectively under house arrest in a country manor. For a year, she lived in this limbo, neither fully prisoner nor free, watched constantly, her correspondence monitored, her movements restricted. It was a different kind of torture, this uncertainty about her future. She could not plan, could not prepare, could not do anything but wait and hope that Mary would eventually be convinced of her innocence. During this year at Woodstock, Elizabeth demonstrated the patience that would characterize her reign. She did not rage against her imprisonment or plot desperate escapes. She kept her dignity, maintained her protests of innocence, and showed appropriate submission to Mary's authority. She attended Catholic services when required, though her Protestant sympathies were well known. She played the role of the misunderstood but loyal sister, never giving Mary's spies any evidence to use against her. Mary's reign grew increasingly unpopular. Her marriage to Philip of Spain, her persecution of Protestants, her phantom pregnancy that turned out to be illness, all combined to make her seem like a monarch favored by neither God nor country. Protestant martyrs burned at Smithfield and other locations, earning Mary the nickname Bloody Mary that would follow her through history. Over 300 people were executed for heresy during her reign, and the burnings shocked even many Catholics who supported the return to the old faith. Through all of this, Elizabeth waited. She understood something crucial about power that Mary never grasped. Force could compel compliance, but it could not win genuine loyalty. Terror might silence opposition, but it could not transform hearts or minds. Elizabeth watched her sister's reign deteriorate and learned what not to do when she finally gained power. She saw how religious persecution backfired, how rigidity alienated even supporters, how isolation from one's people created dangerous vulnerabilities. By 1558, Mary was dying. The Queen who had fought so hard for her throne, who had tried so desperately to restore Catholic faith to England, was losing her battle with what was probably ovarian cancer. She had failed to produce an heir, failed to win her people's love, failed in almost everything except holding on to power until the end. As Mary lay dying, England's attention turned to Elizabeth. Despite all of Mary's efforts, despite the dangers and suspicions and imprisonments, Elizabeth had survived. She was next in line. The crown would pass to her. Physically, under Mary's rule, had refined Elizabeth like steel in a forge. She had learned patience and subtlety. She had learned when to bend and when to resist. She had learned to control her emotions, to present the face that served her purposes rather than revealing her true feelings. She had learned that survival sometimes required compromise, and that compromise was not the same as surrender. She had learned to read people, to understand their motivations, to anticipate dangers before they became threats. Most importantly, she had learned about the responsibilities of power. She had seen what happened when a monarch put personal conviction ahead of political wisdom, when religious zeal overcame prudence, when fear drove policy instead of careful calculation. She had seen the cost of inflexibility and the price of alienating one's subjects. These lessons would guide her when she finally sat on England's throne. When word came on November 17, 1558, that Mary had died and Elizabeth was now queen, the young woman who had survived so much finally allowed herself to hope. According to legend, she was sitting under an oak tree at Hatfield when the news arrived. She dropped to her knees and quoted Psalm 118 in Latin. "This is the Lord's doing, and it is marvelous in our eyes." Then she stood up, no longer Lady Elizabeth, but Queen Elizabeth, and the real work of her life began. Her blood-soaked path had led here. From the scaffold that took her, from childhood trauma to teenage scandal to years of imprisonment and danger, Elizabeth had travelled a road that would have broken lesser souls. But she had not broken. She had bent, she had waited, she had endured. And now, at 25 years old, she was Queen of England, ready to show her kingdom and the world what she had learned along the way. The glorious accession. Amber 17, 1558 marked the beginning of an age that would transform England from an isolated, struggling kingdom into a global power. When Elizabeth Tudor learned of her half-sister's death and her own accession to the throne, she accepted the crown with both determination and awareness of the immense challenges facing her. At 25 years old, she became queen of a nation divided by religion, drained by war, and uncertain about its future. The task before her seemed almost insurmountable. Aising kingdom Elizabeth inherited was in crisis on every front. Mary's marriage to Philip of Spain had pulled England into a war with France that resulted in the loss of Calais, England's last possession on the continent, and a humiliating blow to national pride. The religious persecution under Mary had left deep wounds in English society, with Protestants angry and Catholics anxious about what a Protestant queen might do to them. The treasury was depleted, the currency debased, and economic troubles plagued both countryside and city. England had few reliable allies and many potential enemies. Polarization possessed advantages that her sister had lacked. She was young where Mary had been middle-aged and sickly. She represented religious moderation where Mary had championed Catholic extremism. Most importantly, she understood her people in ways that Mary never had. Elizabeth was English to her core, while Mary had been half Spanish by mother and fully Spanish in sympathy through her marriage. The English people were ready for a change, and Elizabeth offered them hope. Her coronation procession through London on January 14, 1559, demonstrated Elizabeth's political genius. She understood that monarchy was theatre as much as government, that the people needed to see their queen and feel a personal connection to her. She rode through streets decorated in her honour, stopping to receive flowers from children, pausing to hear speeches from city officials, responding with warmth and graciousness to her subjects' demonstrations of loyalty. She smiled, she waved, she showed herself to her people as their queen, but also as a woman who cared about their welfare. Witnesses recorded that Elizabeth seemed genuinely moved by the demonstrations of affection from the crowds. When an old woman offered her flowers, the Queen stopped her procession to accept them with thanks. When schoolchildren presented a pageant, she watched attentively and praised their performance. She responded to the speeches given in her honor with eloquence that both honored the speakers and connected her to the deeper emotions of the moment. This was not a queen who viewed herself as above her people, but one who saw herself as their protector and champion. The coronation itself took place the next day, January 15, at Westminster Abbey. Elizabeth was crowned and anointed in ceremonies that linked her to every English monarch going back to William the Conqueror beyond. She took the oaths, received the symbols of royal authority, and was proclaimed Queen of England and Ireland before a congregation that included both Protestant and Catholic nobles. The ceremonies were deliberately designed to signal continuity with the past, while hinting at changes to come. Elizabeth was positioning herself as a legitimate monarch in the traditional mold, while also preparing to chart a new course for her kingdom. One of her first and most important tasks was establishing her government. Elizabeth had learned from watching her father and siblings that the quality of one's advisors often determined the success or failure of one's reign. She needed people who were competent, loyal, and willing to give her honest counsel, even when she might not want to hear it. She found such men, most notably William Cecil, whom she appointed as her principal secretary. Cecil, later Lord Burleigh, would serve Elizabeth for 40 years, becoming one of the most capable administrators in English history. Skyrocket's selection of Cecil demonstrated her political wisdom. He was Protestant but moderate, experienced but not rigid, ambitious for his country rather than just himself. He understood finance, foreign policy, and domestic politics. Most importantly, he was willing to work tirelessly in Elizabeth's service without trying to dominate her or make decisions without her consent. The relationship between Elizabeth and Cecil would be the foundation of her government's success, a partnership built on mutual respect and shared commitment to England's welfare. Undermined, the religious settlement Elizabeth crafted in the first months of her reign showed her political genius at its finest. She understood that Mary's Catholic restoration had failed not just because it was Catholic, but because it was extreme. Elizabeth sought a middle way, a religious settlement that would satisfy most English people without alienating anyone so badly that they felt compelled to rebel. The result was the Elizabethan religious settlement, a compromise that established the Church of England as Protestant in doctrine, but Catholic in much of its ceremony and structure. The settlement made Elizabeth Supreme Governor of the Church of England, a slightly softer title than her father's Supreme Head. It required attendance at Anglican services, but did not inquire too closely into what people actually believed. Elizabeth's famous statement that she would not make windows into men's souls captured the essence of her religious policy. She cared about outward conformity and loyalty to the crown, but she had no interest in persecuting people for their private beliefs as long as those beliefs did not threaten her government. This moderate approach earned Elizabeth criticism from both extremes. Committed Catholics wanted a return to Rome and papal authority. Puritans wanted further Protestant reform and the elimination of all Catholic remnants from church services. But the vast majority of English people, weary of religious strife and persecution, embraced the compromise. They could attend services that felt familiar, whether their sympathies lay with the old faith or the new, and they could do so without fear of being burned as heretics or executed as traitors. Elizabeth's court became the center of English cultural and political life in ways it had not been under Mary. The young queen surrounded herself with intelligent, accomplished people who could provide both good conversation and useful counsel. She patronized the arts, encouraging poets, playwrights, and musicians. She maintained a magnificent court that displayed England's wealth and power to foreign visitors, while also serving as a gathering place for the English nobility. She understood that a successful monarchy required spectacle and grandeur, that people needed to see their queen as something more than merely human. But Elizabeth never forgot that beneath the crown and the elaborate gowns and the jewels, she was a woman in a world that did not believe women could rule successfully. She faced constant pressure to marry, to find a husband who could handle the real business of government while she provided heirs. Her counselors reminded her endlessly that England needed a male heir, that her death without children would plunge the kingdom into chaos. Foreign princes and English nobles offered themselves as potential husbands, each proposing marriage as the solution to England's problems. Elizabeth resisted all of it. In her first speech to Parliament in 1559, she declared that it would be sufficient for her to live and die a virgin, married to her kingdom. She was not simply making a dramatic statement. She had seen what happened to queens who married. Her mother had been executed by her husband. Mary had been manipulated by Philip of Spain and suffered phantom pregnancies that humiliated her. Elizabeth understood that marriage would mean surrendering control of her kingdom to her husband, as law and custom gave a woman's property and authority to her spouse. She chose instead to remain unmarried, using the possibility of marriage as a diplomatic tool while never actually committing to any suitor. This strategy drove her advisors to distraction but served England's interests remarkably well. Foreign princes courted English alliance through proposing marriage to the Queen. Domestic nobles could hope for royal favour through their pursuit of her hand. Elizabeth could play one suitor against another, buying time and advantage while never surrendering her independence. The early years of her reign established patterns that would define Elizabeth's entire time on the throne. She would work tirelessly at the business of government, reading papers, consulting advisors, making decisions herself rather than delegating to others. She would be cautious in committing to major policies, preferring to wait and see rather than act hastily. She would maintain magnificent display while actually being relatively frugal with government funds. She would seek middle ways and compromises rather than pursuing extreme courses. And she would never, ever marry or name an heir, keeping power firmly in her own hands. By the time Elizabeth had been queen for a year, England was already changing. The religious persecutions had ended, replaced by a policy of tolerance that, while not perfect, was far more humane than what had come before. The government was functioning efficiently under Cecil's administration and Elizabeth's oversight. The economy showed signs of recovery. Foreign relations were still delicate, but England was no longer isolated or vulnerable. The young queen had exceeded everyone's expectations, proving herself capable of ruling in her own right. The glorious accession had given England a queen who would reign for 45 years, through times of danger and triumph, leading her kingdom to heights no one had imagined possible. But all of that still lay ahead. For now, Elizabeth had simply proven that she could do the job, that a woman could rule England successfully, that the daughter of Anne Boleyn and the sister who had survived Mary's persecution was worthy of the crown. It was a beginning, and what a beginning it proved to be. The Virgin Queen and the Heart's Prisoner. Mailed. If Elizabeth Tudor had one true love in her life, it was Robert Dudley. Their relationship became the subject of endless speculation, gossip, scandal, and historical debate. Were they lovers in the physical sense? Did Elizabeth secretly bear his child? Did she want to marry him, but circumstances prevented it? The truth is both simpler and more complex than the rumors. Elizabeth and Robert loved each other deeply, but theirs was a love shaped and constrained by politics, power, and the demands of queenship. Robert Dudley was Elizabeth's childhood friend, one of the few people she had known during both the good times and the bad. His father, John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, had been the power behind young King Edward VI's throne and the architect of the attempt to place Lady Jane Grey on the throne instead of Mary. When that plot failed, Robert was imprisoned in the Tower of London at the same time Elizabeth was there after Wyatt's rebellion. They had survived those dark days separately, but shared the experience of facing possible execution. They understood each other in ways that others could not. Pedestrians became queen. One of her first acts was to appoint Robert Dudley as Master of the Horse, a position that kept him constantly at her side. The Master of the Horse was responsible for the royal stables and accompanied the Queen wherever she went. It meant Robert was with Elizabeth almost daily, riding beside her, attending her at court, being her companion and confidant. Their closeness quickly became obvious to everyone at court, and the gossip began almost immediately. Robert was tall, handsome, athletic, and charismatic. He shared Elizabeth's love of riding, hunting, and dancing. They could talk for hours about books, politics, and the affairs of state. He made her laugh, something she desperately needed after the years of danger and stress. He understood her moods, knew when to press and when to back off, could lighten her spirits when she was burdened by the weight of crown and kingdom. Elizabeth called him her bonny, sweet Robin, and used the symbol O, meaning eyes, as a nickname for him in their correspondence. But there was one enormous obstacle to any deeper relationship between them. Robert Dudley was married. His wife, Amy Robsart, lived quietly in the countryside while Robert attended the Queen at court. The marriage had been arranged when Robert and Amy were young, and by the time Elizabeth became Queen, the relationship appeared to have cooled. Amy rarely came to court, and Robert spent almost all his time with Elizabeth. But Amy existed, and as long as she did, Elizabeth could not marry Robert, even if she wanted to. Then, in September 1560, something happened that changed everything while simultaneously making marriage impossible. Amy Robsart was found dead at the bottom of the stairs at Cumnor Place, where she was staying. Her neck was broken, and the circumstances immediately raised suspicions of murder. Had Robert killed his wife to free himself to marry Elizabeth? Had Elizabeth ordered Amy's death? The rumors spread like wildfire, and the scandal threatened to destroy both Robert's reputation and Elizabeth's reign. An inquest was held, and it returned a verdict of accidental death. But no one really believed it. The timing was too convenient, the circumstances too suspicious. Modern historians have proposed various theories, including that Amy might have had breast cancer and committed suicide, or that the fall really was an accident, or that someone else killed her to create exactly this scandal and prevent Elizabeth from marrying Robert. But in 1560, public opinion quickly concluded that Robert had murdered Amy, probably with Elizabeth's knowledge, if not her direct involvement. The scandal made it impossible for Elizabeth to marry Robert. To do so would have been to confirm everyone's worst suspicions, to suggest that she had indeed conspired in Amy's murder to free her beloved for marriage. It would have damaged Elizabeth's reputation beyond repair and potentially cost her the throne. Foreign powers would have used it as evidence of her unfitness to rule. Catholic factions would have had powerful ammunition to support Mary, Queen of Scots' claim to be the rightful Queen of England. Domestic nobles would have questioned whether a woman who would conspire to murder for personal gain could be trusted with the kingdom's welfare. Elizabeth and Robert both understood this, yet they could not simply walk away from each other either. Their love, whatever form it took, was too deep and too important to both of them. So they found a different way forward. Robert remained at court as Elizabeth's favourite, clearly the man she cared for most deeply, but without the title of consort or the official status of husband. Elizabeth refused all other suitors, but also never married Robert. They existed in a state of permanent tension, loving each other, but separated by circumstance and duty. Elizabeth tried various schemes to solve her Robert problem. In 1563, she proposed that Robert marry Mary, Queen of Scots, suggesting that this would secure an alliance between England and Scotland while keeping Robert nearby. She even offered to make Robert Earl of Leicester to raise his status appropriately for such a match. The proposal was bizarre and insulting to everyone involved. Mary, unsurprisingly, rejected the idea of marrying Elizabeth's cast-off favourite. Robert was hurt that Elizabeth would suggest giving him to another woman. The whole scheme revealed Elizabeth's internal conflict, wanting to keep Robert close while also acknowledging that she could not, or would not, marry him herself. In 1564, Elizabeth finally made Robert Earl of Leicester, a title that brought wealth, status, and political power. It was her way of showing her affection and her trust while still keeping him at a certain distance. Leicester, as he was now called, became one of the most powerful men in England, a member of the Privy Council and a leading voice in Protestant and anti-Spanish factions. But he was not, and never would be, king. Leicester did not give up hope of marrying Elizabeth for many years. He proposed directly to her at Christmas 1565, and when she evaded giving a clear answer, he left court in anger. Elizabeth immediately summoned him back and commanded him never to leave her again. She needed him, depended on him, loved him, but she would not marry him. He had to accept her terms or lose her entirely. And Leicester chose to stay, even without the ultimate prize he desired. The years passed, and their relationship deepened, even as it remained unconsummated officially. Leicester was Elizabeth's most trusted confidant, the person she turned to in times of crisis and celebration alike. When she nearly died of smallpox in 1562, she allegedly ordered that if she died, Leicester should be made protector of the realm with a generous income, a sign of how much she trusted him and how much he meant to her. When the Spanish Armada threatened in 1588, Leicester commanded the army assembled to defend England, showing Elizabeth's faith in his military abilities and her need to have him at her side during the greatest crisis of her reign. But Leicester also grew frustrated with the limits of his position. After 17 years of waiting and hoping, he decided to marry again. In 1578, he secretly wed Lettice Knowles, a cousin of Elizabeth and the widow of the Earl of Essex. He knew Elizabeth would be furious, which is why he kept the marriage secret for as long as possible. When she inevitably found out, her rage was terrible to behold. She felt betrayed by the man she loved, the man who had sworn he would wait for her forever. Leicester was banished from court, and Lettice was forbidden to ever appear before the Queen. But Elizabeth could not stay angry at Leicester for long. She needed him too much, loved him too deeply. Within a few months, he was back at court, though their relationship had changed. There was sadness now, a recognition that time was passing and choices made earlier could not be unmade. They had both sacrificed their chances for conventional married happiness, he for his devotion to her, she for her devotion to her kingdom. In September 1588, shortly after the victory over the Spanish Armada, Leicester died at age 55. He had been ill for some time, suffering from what was probably stomach cancer. He managed to write Elizabeth one final letter, expressing his continued devotion and concern for her health. Elizabeth received the letter just days before his death. When she learned he was gone, she locked herself in her chamber and refused to come out. Her advisors, frightened by her grief, finally had to order the door broken down to reach her. After Elizabeth's own death 15 years later, that last letter from Leicester was found in a small casket beside her bed. She had inscribed it, "His last letter," in her own hand, and kept it close until the end of her life. It was a poignant reminder of the great love of her life, the man she could not marry but never stopped loving. The relationship that defined so much of her emotional life, even as she maintained her position as the Virgin Queen married to England. The story of Elizabeth and Leicester reveals the human cost of Elizabeth's decision to remain unmarried and rule in her own right. She could have married Leicester or another man and lived a more conventional life as a queen consort rather than a ruling queen. She could have had children, could have experienced the joys and sorrows of marriage and family that most people took for granted. But she chose instead to wed herself to England, to make her kingdom her family and her people her children. It was a choice that brought England great benefits. Elizabeth's unmarried state meant she retained full control of her government. It meant she could not be manipulated through a husband. It meant England's interests always came first, never subordinated to a consort's foreign homeland or personal ambitions. But it was also a choice that cost Elizabeth personally, leaving her alone in ways that even her devoted courtiers could not fully address. The Virgin Queen was virgin not because she had no interest in love or passion, but because she understood that marriage and queenship were incompatible in her circumstances. She loved Robert Dudley deeply and probably would have married him in a different world, one where she was not queen or where marriage would not have cost her the power she needed to protect herself and her kingdom. They found what happiness they could within the constraints of her position, a love affair conducted in public, yet never quite fulfilled. A bond that lasted until Leicester's death and, in Elizabeth's heart, until her own. The Scottish threat. Cultured. Mary Stuart, Queen of Scots, was Elizabeth's cousin, a fellow queen, and the greatest threat to Elizabeth's throne for 2 decades. Their relationship, conducted largely through letters and intermediaries since they never met in person, became one of the most dramatic and tragic royal relationships in history. It was a relationship defined by fear, jealousy, political necessity, and ultimately by Mary's death on Elizabeth's orders, an execution that haunted Elizabeth for the rest of her life. Mary had a better claim to the English throne than Elizabeth in the eyes of many Catholics. Mary's grandmother was Margaret Tudor, Henry VIII's older sister. This made Mary Elizabeth's first cousin once removed and, more importantly, someone whose legitimacy was not questioned. Elizabeth, as the daughter of Anne Boleyn and a marriage that Catholics considered invalid, was regarded as illegitimate by the Catholic Church and its supporters. This meant that many Catholics throughout Europe, and some in England itself, considered Mary, not Elizabeth, to be the rightful Queen of England. Mary's early life read like a romantic tragedy. She became Queen of Scotland as an infant, was sent to France for safety and education, married the French Dauphin, who briefly became King Francis II before dying young. Mary returned to Scotland in 1561, a beautiful, charming Catholic queen ruling over a Protestant country increasingly hostile to her faith and her French ways. She made a series of disastrous personal choices that would eventually destroy her. Second marriage, to her cousin Lord Darnley, began badly and ended worse. Darnley was handsome but weak, ambitious but incompetent, and quickly made himself hated by Scottish nobles. When Mary's secretary David Rizzio was brutally murdered in front of her while she was pregnant, many suspected Darnley's involvement. Then, in 1567, the house where Darnley was staying exploded, and he was found dead in the garden, apparently strangled before the explosion. Scotland erupted in scandal and suspicion. Even worse, Mary almost immediately married the Earl of Bothwell, widely believed to be Darnley's murderer. Whether Mary was involved in Darnley's death, whether Bothwell forced her into marriage, whether she loved him or was his victim, remain debated questions. But to Scotland's Protestant lords, this was the final straw. They rose in rebellion, imprisoned Mary, and forced her to abdicate in favour of her infant son, James. Mary managed to escape and raise an army, but she was defeated in battle. In May 1568, Mary made a decision that would determine the rest of her life. She fled Scotland and crossed into England, hoping her cousin Elizabeth would help her regain her throne. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. Elizabeth had no intention of helping Mary return to power in Scotland. More than that, Elizabeth now had the greatest threat to her throne literally in her custody, and she was not about to let Mary go. Mary spent the next 19 years as Elizabeth's prisoner, moved from castle to castle, kept under guard, never allowed to return to Scotland or leave England. She was maintained in relative comfort, allowed servants and correspondence, but she was never free. Elizabeth justified this imprisonment by pointing to the suspicions surrounding Darnley's murder, by Mary's marriage to his suspected killer, by the instability Mary represented. But the real reason was simpler. As long as Mary lived and was free, she represented an alternative queen for discontented Catholics to rally around. Over those 19 years, multiple plots centered on Mary. Catholic conspirators in England and abroad schemed to assassinate Elizabeth, place Mary on the throne, and restore England to Catholicism. Some plots were serious, others barely more than wishful thinking, but all of them reinforced Elizabeth's belief that Mary could never be allowed freedom. The longer Mary remained imprisoned, the more desperate these plots became, and the more dangerous Mary appeared to English Protestant security. The most serious plot came in 1586 and was known as the Babington Plot, after one of its primary conspirators. Anthony Babington and other young Catholic gentlemen planned to assassinate Elizabeth and free Mary. But Elizabeth's spy master, Sir Francis Walsingham, had infiltrated the conspiracy. He arranged for Mary's letters to be smuggled out to the conspirators and their replies smuggled back to her, all while his agents read and copied everything. The letters provided clear evidence that Mary knew of the assassination plot and had given it her blessing. Walsingham presented the evidence to Elizabeth and the Privy Council. The letters were damning. Mary had not just passively accepted the plot, but had actively encouraged it, discussing the details of Elizabeth's assassination and her own release. Under English law, this was treason. The penalty for treason was death. Elizabeth's advisers, her parliament, and most of her subjects demanded that Mary be executed. But Elizabeth hesitated. The idea of executing an anointed queen was almost unthinkable. It set a terrible precedent, suggesting that subjects could judge and execute their rulers. It would enrage Catholic Europe and possibly provoke military action from Spain or France. Most personally for Elizabeth, it meant killing her own cousin, a fellow queen, a woman who had sought her protection. Elizabeth agonized over the decision for months, trying to find some alternative that would remove Mary as a threat without actually executing her. She even wrote to Mary's jailer, Sir Amyas Paulet, hinting that he might quietly murder Mary and spare Elizabeth the burden of official execution. Paulet, a man of rigid principle, refused in words that became famous. He would not, he wrote, make such a shipwreck of his conscience or leave such a blot on his posterity as to shed blood without law or warrant. Elizabeth was furious that Paulet would not do her dirty work, but she also had to acknowledge his point. If Mary was to die, it would have to be by legal execution, not secret murder. Finally, on February 1st, 1587, Elizabeth signed Mary's death warrant. She gave it to her secretary, William Davison, possibly with instructions to wait before implementing it. But Elizabeth's Privy Council, fearing she would change her mind again, immediately sent the warrant to Fotheringhay Castle, where Mary was held. They decided to carry out the execution without waiting for further confirmation from Elizabeth. On February 8, 1587, Mary, Queen of Scots, was beheaded at Fotheringhay. She faced death with remarkable courage and dignity. She wore red, the Catholic colour of martyrdom, and spoke words of forgiveness to her executioners. The execution itself was botched, requiring 2 blows to sever her head, and when the executioner lifted the head to show the crowd, Mary's auburn wig came off in his hand, revealing grey hair underneath. Even in death, there was spectacle and pathos. When Elizabeth learned that the execution had been carried out, her reaction was one of rage and grief. She claimed she had not meant for the warrant to be sent, that Davison had acted without her knowledge, that the Privy Council had exceeded their authority. She had Davison arrested and imprisoned in the Tower, though he was later released. Whether Elizabeth's anger was genuine or calculated remains debated. She may have truly wanted more time to consider the decision, or she may have arranged this fiction to give herself plausible deniability, to claim she had not really meant to execute Mary. The execution of Mary, Queen of Scots, removed a threat that had loomed over Elizabeth for decades. It also freed Philip II of Spain to launch his Armada against England without concern for Mary's interests, since she was no longer alive to be rescued and placed on England's throne. In that sense, Mary's death was a necessary prelude to England's greatest military trial. proclaimed, but the execution also took a personal toll on Elizabeth. She had ordered the death of her own cousin, a fellow queen, a woman who had sought her protection. Catholic Europe denounced her as a murderess. Scotland's King James, Mary's son, protested his mother's execution, though not so strenuously that it damaged his chances of eventually inheriting the English throne. Elizabeth, who prided herself on her mercy and her preference for moderation over extremism, had been forced into an extreme action. The relationship between Elizabeth and Mary was never simple. They were cousins but rivals, fellow queens but enemies, women who should have been allies, but instead found themselves on opposite sides of religious and political divides. Mary was everything Elizabeth was not: beautiful, romantic, emotional, guided more by passion than calculation. Elizabeth was everything Mary was not: shrewd, cautious, politically astute, willing to sacrifice personal happiness for political survival. In the end, Elizabeth survived and Mary did not, but the price of that survival was guilt that would haunt Elizabeth for the rest of her reign. She had done what she believed necessary to protect herself and her kingdom, but she had done it at the cost of her cousin's life. That cost would weigh on her conscience, particularly in her later years when she looked back on the choices she had made and the blood she had shed to keep her crown. The Scottish threat had been eliminated, but the victory had come at a price. Mary was dead, but Elizabeth would carry the weight of that death for the rest of her life. The Armada, England's finest hour. In the summer of 1588, the greatest confrontation of Elizabeth's reign unfolded in the waters of the English Channel. Spain, the most powerful empire in the world, sent a vast armada to invade England, overthrow the Protestant queen, and restore Catholic rule. What followed was a battle that would define both Elizabeth's reign and England's emerging identity as a naval power, a conflict that became legend even before the last Spanish ships limped home in defeat. Perpendicular, the roots of the conflict stretched back years. King Philip II of Spain, who had briefly been married to Elizabeth's sister Mary, had initially tried to maintain good relations with England, despite the religious divide. But a series of provocations and conflicts gradually pushed the two nations toward war. English privateers, essentially licensed pirates like Sir Francis Drake, raided Spanish treasure fleets returning from the Americas, stealing gold and silver that Philip needed to fund his empire. Elizabeth tacitly encouraged these raids, even taking a share of the profits while maintaining official deniability. England's support for Protestant rebels in the Spanish Netherlands was another source of tension. The Dutch were fighting for independence from Spanish rule, and Elizabeth provided them with money, weapons, and eventually troops. From Philip's perspective, Elizabeth was funding rebellion in his territories and needed to be stopped. The execution of Mary, Queen of Scots, in February 1587 removed the last restraint. Philip had previously hesitated to invade England because such an invasion would only benefit Mary, a woman with French sympathies. With Mary dead, Philip was free to invade for his own purposes. The Spanish Armada that set sail in May 1588 was enormous by the standards of the time. Approximately 130 ships, carrying about 30,000 men, the fleet represented the largest naval force Spain had ever assembled. The plan was for the Armada to sail up the English Channel, rendezvousing with the Duke of Parma's army of veterans from the Netherlands. Together they would invade England, overwhelm Elizabeth's defenders, and install a Catholic monarch loyal to Spain. The Duke of Medina Sidonia commanded the Armada, though he had little naval experience and had begged not to be given the command. But the original commander had died, and Philip insisted that Medina Sidonia take charge. The Duke was a capable administrator, but no admiral, and he knew it. Nevertheless, he organized the massive fleet and set sail with instructions to join Parma and conquer England for Spain and the Catholic faith. England's preparations demonstrated both Elizabeth's strategic foresight and her characteristic frugality. She had invested in the navy throughout her reign, building new ships and maintaining older ones. English galleons were faster and more maneuverable than the large Spanish ships, with superior long-range cannon. But Elizabeth had not spent enough provisions and pay, which would cause problems even in victory. She appointed Lord Howard of Effingham as Lord High Admiral, with Sir Francis Drake as Vice Admiral. It was a wise choice. Howard was a nobleman with the authority to command respect, while Drake was the most experienced sea captain in England. On July 19, 1588, the Spanish Armada was sighted off the Lizard in Cornwall. Beacons were lit across England, signal fires that had been prepared for exactly this moment. The warnings spread across the kingdom. The invasion fleet was coming. Elizabeth's subjects held their breath, waiting to see if their queen and their Protestant faith would survive the coming storm. Legend says that Drake was playing bowls at Plymouth when news of the Armada arrived, and that he insisted on finishing his game before sailing to confront the Spanish. The story is probably apocryphal, but it captures something real about English confidence and Drake's personality. The English were outnumbered, but not outclassed, and they knew it. The battle that followed was really a series of engagements fought over several days as the Armada sailed up the English Channel in a massive crescent formation. The English harried the Spanish ships with long-range cannon fire, using their superior speed to stay out of reach of Spanish attempts to close for boarding actions. The Spanish wanted to grapple English ships and overwhelm them with soldiers. The English wanted to stand off and pound the Spanish with cannon fire. English tactics prevailed, but neither side managed a decisive victory in these early encounters. The turning point came at Calais, where the Armada anchored to await word from the Duke of Parma. But Parma was not ready, his troops blocked by Dutch ships from reaching the rendezvous point. While the Spanish fleet sat at anchor, the English prepared a weapon that would break the Armada's formation and change the course of the battle. They sent in fireships. On the night of July 28th, 8 English ships were set ablaze and sent sailing directly into the anchored Spanish fleet. The sight of fireships bearing down on them terrified the Spanish crews. Captains cut their anchor cables and scattered in panic, abandoning their tight formation to escape the flames. The fireships did little physical damage, but they destroyed the Armada's discipline and organization. The next day, off Gravelines, the English attacked the scattered Spanish fleet with devastating effect. The battle raged for 8 hours, with English cannon fire raking Spanish ships that could no longer maintain their defensive formation. Several Spanish ships were sunk or forced to run aground. The English did not suffer a single ship lost. By the end of the day, the Armada was in retreat, sailing north into the North Sea with the English in pursuit. The Spanish could not turn back or land their troops. They were forced to sail around Scotland and Ireland to return to Spain, a route made treacherous by storms and rocky coasts. Ship after ship was lost to weather, starvation, and disease. Of the 130 ships that had sailed from Spain, fewer than 70 returned. Over 15,000 men perished. The invincible Armada had been crushed, though more by weather and English tactics than any single decisive battle. Elizabeth's role in the Armada crisis went beyond simply preparing defences. While the battle raged at sea, she made one of the most famous speeches of her reign, addressing her troops assembled at Tilbury to repel the expected Spanish invasion. She wore armour and rode on horseback among her soldiers, presenting herself as a warrior queen ready to fight alongside her subjects. Her speech combined recognition of her feminine vulnerability with assertion of masculine courage and patriotic fervour. "I know I have the body of a weak, feeble woman," she declared, "but I have the heart and stomach of a king, and of a king of England too." She promised to live or die among her people, sharing their dangers and their glory. She praised their loyalty and their courage, assuring them that victory would be theirs. The soldiers, already motivated to defend their homeland, found their spirits lifted by a queen who showed herself willing to share their fate. The defeat of the Spanish Armada was seen throughout Protestant Europe as a miracle, proof that God favoured the Protestant cause. Medals were struck in England, bearing the Latin inscription, "God blew, and they were scattered," referring to the storms that had helped destroy the Spanish fleet. Elizabeth's reputation soared. She had faced the greatest power in Europe and emerged victorious. England, which had been a struggling kingdom on the edge of Europe, suddenly appeared as a formidable power that could defend itself against any threat. But the victory came with deep personal cost for Elizabeth. Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester, who had commanded the army at Tilbury and been at Elizabeth's side throughout the crisis, died just weeks after the Armada's defeat. He was exhausted and ill, suffering from what was probably stomach cancer, and the stress of the Armada preparations had taken its toll. His death devastated Elizabeth. She had just won the greatest victory of her reign, but she had lost the man she loved. The triumph was bittersweet, glory mixed with grief. The Armada's defeat did not end the war with Spain. Philip II sent 2 more armadas in the 1590s, both scattered by storms before reaching England. England sent its own unsuccessful armada against Spain in 1589. The conflict dragged on until after Elizabeth's death, draining resources and costing lives. But the summer of 1588 remained special, a moment when England had faced its greatest test and prevailed. Gravitational victory over the Armada shaped English national identity for centuries to come. It established England as a major naval power, beginning the tradition of British naval dominance that would last for 300 years. It proved that Catholic Europe could not crush the Protestant kingdom. It showed that Elizabeth, a woman ruling in her own right, could lead her nation to victory over the greatest empire of the age. It was England's finest hour, and it was Elizabeth's finest hour as well. The Spanish Armada's defeat demonstrated everything that made Elizabeth a great monarch. Her strategic preparation over years of investing in the navy, her careful choice of commanders, her ability to inspire her people, her courage in facing down threats that would have terrified lesser rulers. She had taken a divided, struggling kingdom and turned it into a nation capable of defeating the most powerful empire in the world. That was an achievement that would echo through history. As news of the victory spread across England, people celebrated in the streets. Bonfires were lit, bells were rung, prayers of thanksgiving were offered. The Protestant Queen had triumphed over Catholic Spain. England was safe. Elizabeth was vindicated. The Virgin Queen had proven that she needed no husband to defend her kingdom. She was queen and warrior both, Gloriana indeed. The victory secured her place in history and ensured that the Elizabethan age would be remembered as a golden time for England. But even as the celebrations continued, Elizabeth mourned for Leicester, her sweet Robin, the man who had been at her side for 30 years and would be there no more. The Golden Age unfolds. Millennia. The defeat of the Spanish Armada marked the beginning of what would later be called the Elizabethan Golden Age, though Elizabeth herself never used such a term. The final 15 years of her reign saw an explosion of cultural creativity, economic expansion, and exploration that transformed England from an isolated kingdom on the edge of Europe into a nation with global ambitions and achievements that would influence the world for centuries. The Elizabethan theatre reached heights that have never been exceeded. William Shakespeare arrived in London in the late 1580s and began his career as an actor and playwright just as England's confidence was soaring after the Armada's defeat. His early comedies and history plays found enthusiastic audiences eager for entertainment that celebrated English virtues and explored human nature with unprecedented insight. By the 1590s, Shakespeare was the leading playwright in London, producing masterworks like Romeo and Juliet, A Midsummer Night's Dream, Much Ado About Nothing, and his great history plays about English kings. Christopher Marlowe, Shakespeare's rival and near contemporary, pushed the boundaries of what theatre could do with plays like Dr. Faustus and Tamburlaine. His use of blank verse and exploration of dark themes influenced Shakespeare and other playwrights. Marlowe's mysterious death in 1593 killed in a tavern brawl at age 29, remains one of the great unsolved mysteries of literary history. Some think he was murdered for political reasons, others that he was a spy killed by fellow agents. Whatever the truth, his brief career helped define Elizabethan drama. Policing. Elizabeth herself attended performances at court and supported the theatre industry, even when Puritan critics condemned it as immoral. She understood that theatre served political purposes, promoting English values and providing entertainment that helped maintain social order. The great acting companies operated under noble patronage, including the Lord Chamberlain's men, which included Shakespeare. The theatres themselves, like the Globe, became architectural landmarks where all levels of society mingled to watch plays that explored everything from ancient history to contemporary politics. Poetry flourished equally. Edmund Spenser dedicated his masterwork, The Fairy Queen, to Elizabeth, using allegorical verse to praise the Queen while exploring complex questions of morality and governance. Philip Sidney, Leicester's nephew and Elizabeth's godson, wrote brilliant poetry and prose before his early death in battle in 1586. Sir Walter Raleigh combined poetry with exploration and politics, becoming one of the most versatile figures of the age. Elizabeth herself wrote poetry in multiple languages, though she published little during her lifetime. Music thrived under Elizabeth's patronage. William Byrd and Thomas Tallis served as gentlemen of the Chapel Royal, composing music for religious services, court entertainment. Byrd in particular created works that remained in the English musical repertoire for centuries. Elizabeth played the virginals, a keyboard instrument, and was said to be quite skilled. Music was an essential part of court life, and talented musicians could gain royal favour and financial support. Architecture reflected England's growing wealth and confidence. Country houses like Longleat and Hardwick Hall were built in a distinctive English style that combined Renaissance influences with traditional English elements. These great houses showcased the wealth of newly enriched gentry and nobility, while providing grand settings for entertaining the Queen during her summer progresses. Elizabeth herself commissioned little building, preferring to save money and let her subjects compete to provide hospitality. But her reign saw a building boom as newly wealthy merchants and landowners displayed their prosperity. Exploration expanded England's horizons beyond Europe. Sir Francis Drake circumnavigated the globe from 1577 to 1580, plundering Spanish treasure along the way and returning to England a hero. Elizabeth knighted him aboard his ship, the Golden Hind, showing her approval of his exploits even though they infuriated Spain. Sir Walter Raleigh sponsored expeditions to North America, attempting to establish a colony at Roanoke that ultimately failed, but demonstrated English ambitions in the New World. Sir Humphrey Gilbert claimed Newfoundland for England in 1583, though he died on the return voyage. The search for the Northwest Passage to Asia motivated numerous expeditions, though none succeeded in finding the route. But these voyages of exploration mapped unknown coasts, established trading relationships, and prepared the ground for the later expansion of English colonization. Elizabeth recognized their importance and granted charters and monopolies to encourage further exploration. Econentior's growth accompanied cultural achievements. English merchants established trading relationships across Europe and beyond. The Muscovy Company traded with Russia. The Levant Company operated in the Mediterranean and Middle East. Most importantly, Elizabeth granted a charter to the East India Company in 1600, establishing the organization that would eventually make Britain dominant in India and much of Asia. English wool remained the foundation of the economy, but new industries and trade routes diversified and strengthened English commerce. Elizabeth's careful management of finances kept England solvent despite the costs of the war with Spain. She was notoriously frugal, refusing to spend money unnecessarily and forcing her subjects to bear many costs through loans and taxes. This parsimony frustrated her councillors and military commanders who wanted more resources for their projects. but it also kept England from the bankruptcies that plagued Spain and France. Elizabeth understood that financial stability was essential to political stability, and she guarded the treasury carefully. The combination of cultural flourishing, economic growth, and military success created a sense of national pride and possibility. England was no longer struggling to survive, but confidently asserting itself on the European and world stage. Elizabeth became the symbol of this transformation. Gloriana, the Virgin Queen who had led England to greatness. Portraits showed her eternally young, covered in symbolic imagery celebrating her virtues and achievements. Reality might show an aging woman, but the official image presented timeless majesty. Combating of Elizabeth reached its height during these years. The anniversary of her accession became a national holiday, celebrated with bells, bonfires, and public festivities. Poets praised her in elaborate verses. Portraits depicted her as the personification of England itself, holding symbols of power and wisdom. She became almost a secular saint, the Virgin Queen married to England, sacrificing personal happiness for her people's welfare. This image was carefully cultivated by Elizabeth and her propagandists, but it also reflected genuine popular affection and gratitude. Elizabeth's progresses through her kingdom during the summer months allowed her subjects to see their queen in person. These elaborate tours cost her hosts enormous sums as they competed to provide ever more lavish entertainment. But they served important political purposes, allowing Elizabeth to maintain connection with her nobles, show herself to ordinary people, and remind everyone of royal power and presence. She could be gracious and accessible one moment, imperious and demanding the next, always maintaining the dignity of queenship, while also displaying personal charm. But even as the Golden Age unfolded, challenges remained. The war with Spain continued, draining resources and lives. Ireland remained turbulent, requiring military expeditions and brutal suppression of rebellions. Religious tensions persisted between more extreme Protestants who wanted further reform and Catholics who still hoped for restoration of the old faith. Economic hardship affected the poor, even as the wealthy built their great houses. Elizabeth's refusal to name a successor created uncertainty about the future. Yet for all these continuing problems, the 1590s represented the peak of Elizabethan achievement. The England that Shakespeare depicted in his plays, the world of exploration and discovery, the flowering of arts and learning, all created a period that later generations would look back on with nostalgia. The Elizabethan age was not perfect, but it was extraordinary, and it was largely shaped by the woman who sat on England's throne. Elizabeth had survived to create something worth surviving for. She had taken a divided kingdom and made it confident. She had faced down enemies and emerged victorious. She had proven that a woman could rule successfully in a man's world. Windshield would not last forever. Elizabeth was aging, the problems mounting, the costs of her achievements becoming clearer. But for a time, England shone, and Elizabeth was the sun at the center of it all. Gloriana, indeed. The Twilight Years. By the 1590s, Elizabeth was entering her 60s, old by the standards of her time and showing the accumulated effects of a lifetime spent carrying England's burdens. The magnificent red-gold hair was mostly gone, replaced by elaborate wigs. The white face paint she wore to maintain the illusion of eternal youth was layered on so thickly that it cracked and flaked. Her teeth had rotted, a common problem in an age of poor dental care, causing her constant pain and making eating difficult. Yet she insisted on maintaining appearances, sitting for portraits that showed her as ageless Gloriana, even as her body betrayed the fantasy. The costs of the long war with Spain were mounting. English forces fought in Ireland, the Netherlands, and at sea, draining the treasury that Elizabeth had worked so hard to keep full. Parliament grew increasingly restive about voting new taxes, questioning whether the war was being conducted efficiently. Elizabeth had to balance the need for resources against her subjects' reluctance to pay. She cut costs wherever she could, sometimes leaving soldiers and sailors unpaid, which created resentment and reduced effectiveness. Punctuation represented England's greatest military challenge of these years. English control over Ireland had always been tenuous, limited to the area around Dublin called the Pale. The rest of Ireland remained under the control of Gaelic chieftains who resisted English rule. In 1594, Hugh O'Neill, Earl of Tyrone, led a major rebellion that would consume the last decade of Elizabeth's reign. The 9 Years' War, as it came to be called, was brutal and costly. English forces employed scorched earth tactics, burning crops and killing livestock to starve the Irish into submission. Thousands died, and the financial cost was enormous. Elizabeth sent one commander after another to Ireland, and each failed to suppress the rebellion. Robert Devereux, Earl of Essex, was her last and most disastrous choice. Essex was the stepson of her late beloved Leicester, and Elizabeth had transferred some of her affection for the father to the son. But Essex combined personal charm with military incompetence and political ambition. She made him commander in Ireland in 1599, giving him an army and instructions to crush Tyrone's rebellion. Essex failed spectacularly. Instead of engaging Tyrone militarily, he negotiated an unauthorized truce. Then, he abandoned his command and raced back to England to explain himself to Elizabeth. He burst into her private chambers at Nonsuch Palace early in the morning, finding her without her wig or makeup, still in her nightgown. No one saw Elizabeth in such an intimate state. Essex had violated every rule of court etiquette and royal dignity. Elizabeth, who had spent her life carefully controlling her image, was humiliated and furious. Elizabeth initially seemed to forgive Essex, but she could not forget the transgression or his military failures. She stripped him of his offices and honours, leaving him bankrupt and desperate. In February 1601, Essex attempted an insane rebellion, marching through London with a few hundred followers in a confused attempt to seize power. The coup was a farce, quickly suppressed. Essex was arrested, tried for treason, and executed on February 25, 1601. The execution of Essex devastated Elizabeth. She had loved Leicester, transferred that affection to his stepson, and now she had ordered the young man's death. Some sources claim she hesitated before signing the death warrant, hoping Essex would beg for mercy. But Essex faced death with arrogance and courage, refusing to grovel. Elizabeth had no choice but to let the execution proceed. Afterward, she fell into deep depression, struggling with grief and guilt. These personal sorrows combined with mounting political frustrations. The Parliament of 1601 attacked Elizabeth's practice of granting monopolies to courtiers as rewards for service. These monopolies gave individuals exclusive rights to trade in particular goods, allowing them to raise prices and earn profits while consumers paid more. Parliament argued that monopolies hurt the economy and unfairly enriched already wealthy courtiers. Elizabeth had to defend her practices while also recognizing that Parliament had genuine grievances. She responded with what became known as the Golden Speech, delivered to Parliament in November 1601. It was a masterpiece of rhetoric and political maneuvering. Elizabeth thanked Parliament for its concerns, agreed to reform the monopoly system, and reminded her subjects of her lifelong devotion to their welfare. She spoke of her love for England, her willingness to sacrifice everything for her people, her commitment to ruling justly. The speech moved many to tears and temporarily restored her popularity. But the Golden Speech could not hide the realities of an aging queen and a government straining under the burdens of war and economic difficulty. Elizabeth was tired. She had ruled for over 40 years, longer than most monarchs of her time. She had survived assassination plots, rebellions, wars, and political crises that would have destroyed weaker rulers. But she was human, and the accumulated toll was becoming apparent. She still rode on horseback and maintained her public presence, but those close to her could see the decline. The question of succession became increasingly urgent. Elizabeth still refused to name an heir, clinging to the policy that had served her throughout her reign. But her subjects worried about what would happen when she died. Without a clear successor, England could descend into civil war as various claimants fought for the crown. Robert Cecil, son of the late Lord Burleigh, secretly corresponded with James VI of Scotland, preparing for a smooth transition when Elizabeth finally died. But Cecil kept these preparations secret from Elizabeth, knowing she would not approve. The last years of Elizabeth's reign marked by melancholy and a sense of ending. The companions of her youth were dead. Leicester was gone, Burleigh was gone, Walsingham was gone. The new generation of courtiers like Cecil and Essex did not understand her in the same way. She was the last Tudor, the last survivor of the extraordinary dynasty that had transformed England. After her, everything would change. Yet Elizabeth continued to rule. She met with her councillors, made decisions, dealt with the business of government. She maintained the fiction of eternal youth and vitality even as her body failed. She insisted on standing for hours at public ceremonies when sitting would have been more comfortable, refusing to show weakness. She danced at court festivities even when movement caused pain. She would not surrender to age or admit that time was defeating her. The war with Spain finally wound down, neither side achieving decisive victory, but both exhausted by decades of conflict. In Ireland, Lord Mountjoy finally defeated Tyrone, though the victory came at enormous cost. The economy struggled under the weight of taxation and war expenditure. England was tired, and its queen was tired. The Golden Age was ending, though Elizabeth fought to deny it. In her final years, Elizabeth looked back on her reign with both pride and sorrow. She had accomplished much, defeating the Spanish Armada, establishing religious peace, fostering the cultural flourishing that produced Shakespeare. But she had also paid the price. Executing Mary, Queen of Scots, ordering Essex's death, remaining unmarried and childless. She had given her life to England, and England had taken everything she had to give. The twilight years showed Elizabeth's strength and her vulnerability. She was still the queen who had defied Europe's greatest empire. She was still Gloriana, the Virgin Queen, the symbol of English pride and achievement. But she was also an old woman, alone, in ways that even her courtiers and servants could not fully address, facing death without heir or close family. She had chosen England over personal happiness, and she would remain true to that choice until the very end. The end of an era. The winter of 1602 to 1603 was harsh in England, and Elizabeth felt its cold in her bones. She had moved to Richmond Palace, one of her favourite residences, in February. The magnificent palace on the Thames had been built by her grandfather, Henry VII, and she had always found comfort in its familiar halls. But now, even Richmond's warmth could not ease the chill she felt, a coldness that came from within rather than from the winter wind. The death of Catherine Howard, Countess of Nottingham, on February 24, 1603, struck the final blow to Elizabeth's will to live. Catherine had been Elizabeth's close companion since childhood, one of the few people who had known her before she became queen. According to some accounts, Catherine told Elizabeth on her deathbed that she had kept a confession from Robert Devereux, Earl of Essex, before his execution, a confession where Essex had begged forgiveness. If true, it meant Elizabeth had executed Essex, believing he remained defiant, when he had actually repented. The story may be legend, but what is certain is that Catherine's death devastated Elizabeth. Withdrawing, Elizabeth withdrew from public life. She refused to eat properly, taking only sips of broth and refusing solid food. She developed a severe throat infection that made swallowing painful and speech difficult. Her physicians prescribed various remedies, but Elizabeth ignored most of them. She seemed to have lost interest in fighting for her health. Those around her watched helplessly as she declined, understanding that the queen who had survived so much was finally surrendering. Elizabeth refused to go to bed. For 15 hours she stood in her chamber, leaning against cushions, silent and still. Her ladies-in-waiting begged her to lie down, but she shook her head. She believed that if she lay down, she would never rise again. Finally, exhausted beyond endurance, she collapsed. Her servants rushed to cushion her fall, having anticipated this moment, and piled cushions on the floor. They carefully moved her to her bed, where she remained for the final days of her life. For 4 days, Elizabeth lay in her bed at Richmond, barely speaking, slipping in and out of consciousness. Her counsellors gathered, anxious about the succession. Without a named heir, England faced potential civil war. Robert Cecil and others had been secretly corresponding with James VI of Scotland, preparing for his accession, but nothing was official. They needed some sign from Elizabeth that James was her choice. On March 23rd, the Archbishop of Canterbury and other clergy came to pray with Elizabeth. She was too weak to speak much, but she seemed to find comfort in the prayers. According to witnesses, when asked if James VI of Scotland should succeed her, Elizabeth made a circular motion with her hands above her head, indicating a crown. It was the closest she ever came to officially naming her successor. She had refused throughout her 45 years reign to name an heir, understanding that doing so would make her politically vulnerable. Only at death's door did she finally acknowledge what everyone had expected. In the early hours of March 24, 1603, Elizabeth died peacefully. The sun was rising over the Thames, bringing spring light to Richmond Palace. The woman who had been born unwanted, declared illegitimate, imprisoned in the Tower, and crowned against all odds, finally let go. She was 69 years old, having ruled for 45 years. She had outlived her siblings' combined lifetimes and most of her contemporaries. She had seen England transformed from a struggling, divided kingdom into a confident nation with global ambitions. Within hours of Elizabeth's death, the Privy Council proclaimed James VI of Scotland as James I of England. The succession that so many had feared would cause civil war proceeded smoothly, exactly as Cecil had planned. James, son of Mary Queen of Scots, grandson of Margaret Tudor, would unite the crowns of England and Scotland, beginning a new era in British history. The Tudor dynasty was over. Blackmail Elizabeth's body was embalmed and lay in state at Whitehall Palace for 3 weeks before her funeral. On April 28, 1603, her coffin was carried through London streets to Westminster Abbey on a funeral bier drawn by horses draped in black velvet. Above the coffin stood an effigy of Elizabeth in her coronation robes, so lifelike that chronicler John Stowe wrote that the sight caused such general sighing, groaning, and weeping as the like hath not been seen or known in the memory of man. Thousands lined the route, mourning the Queen who had led them through decades of danger and triumph. Whatever complaints they might have had about taxes or monopolies during her life seemed forgotten now. What remained was grief for a queen who had given her life to England, who had remained unmarried to keep her independence, who had faced down the Spanish Armada and made England great. They called her Good Queen Bess, Gloriana, the Virgin Queen, and they mourned her passing as the end of an age. Elizabeth was buried in Westminster Abbey, eventually in the same vault as her half-sister Mary, a final reconciliation in death of the 2 daughters of Henry VIII who had been such opposites in life. James I later commissioned a magnificent tomb for Elizabeth, recognizing that his own legitimacy depended partly on honoring the Queen whose crown he had inherited. The death of Elizabeth marked more than just the passing of a monarch. It represented the end of the Tudor dynasty that had ruled England since 1485, through reformation and religious conflict, through military triumph and cultural flowering. The Tudors had taken England from feudalism toward modernity, from Catholic to Protestant, from isolation toward global ambition. And Elizabeth had been the culmination of it all, the final and greatest Tudor monarch. Her death also marked the end of an age where England had been ruled by that rarest of things, a woman who had proven herself capable not just of sitting on a throne, but of actually ruling, of making decisions, of leading armies and navies, of confronting the greatest powers of Europe and emerging victorious. She had shown that gender did not determine competence, that a woman could be as shrewd a politician, as brave a leader, as effective a monarch as any man. But Elizabeth's death also left England without anyone who remembered the religious conflicts of the mid-16th century, without anyone who had lived through the reigns of all three of Henry VIII's children. A generation was passing, and with it went living memory of how England had become what it was. The new king, James I, was Scottish, foreign to English ways and politics despite his English blood. He would face challenges Elizabeth had never faced, and he would lack her instinctive understanding of the English people. The end of the Elizabethan age left nostalgia in its wake. Even as people welcomed James and hoped for peace and prosperity under his rule, they looked back on Elizabeth's reign with affection and pride. The difficulties and conflicts of her time began to fade from memory, replaced by legends of good Queen Bess, who had led England to greatness. The reality of Elizabethan England, with its poverty and religious tension and military costs, gave way to myths of a golden age when England was strong and its queen was glorious. Corone Elizabeth had understood the power of image and legend better than almost any monarch before or since. She had spent her reign carefully crafting her public persona, presenting herself as the Virgin Queen married to England, as Gloriana, the embodiment of English virtues, as the Protestant champion against Catholic threats. That image, maintained so carefully during her life, became even more powerful after her death. The legends she had helped create became history, and history became legend. Bribe, been born into betrayal, whose mother was executed before she could walk, who had been declared illegitimate and stripped of her title, who had been imprisoned in the Tower and threatened with execution, who had survived to become queen at 25 and ruled until she was 69, had finally found peace. The burdens she had carried for so long, the crown that had both defined and confined her, the kingdom that had been her husband and her child, all could be laid down at last. Kang England wept for her, mourned her, and began almost immediately to create myths about her. Within a generation, the Elizabethan age was already being remembered as a golden time, and Elizabeth herself was becoming a legend. The Virgin Queen who had sacrificed everything for her people and made England great. The reality was more complex, but the legend had its own truth. Elizabeth had been extraordinary, and her passing marked the end of an era. The immortal legacy. Setback. More than 4 centuries have passed since Elizabeth Tudor died at Richmond Palace on that spring morning in 1603. Yet her legacy continues to shape how we think about monarchy, leadership, and the relationship between personal sacrifice and public duty. The Elizabethan age she defined became a touchstone for English and later British national identity, a period that seemed, in retrospect, to represent England at its most confident and creative. But beyond the myths and legends, beyond the portraits of Gloriana in her elaborate gowns and jewels, what was Elizabeth's real achievement? She took a kingdom in crisis and gave it stability. When Elizabeth ascended the throne in 1558, England was divided by religion, bankrupt from war, isolated in European politics, and uncertain about its future. Religious persecution under Mary I had created martyrs and deepened divisions between Protestant and Catholic. The loss of Calais had humiliated English pride. The economy struggled, the currency was debased, and the government had lost the confidence of the people. England seemed a kingdom in terminal decline. Elizabeth transformed that struggling nation into a power that could defeat the Spanish Armada and establish itself as a force in global exploration and trade. She did this not through revolutionary changes, but through careful management, strategic patience, and an instinctive understanding of what her people needed. Her religious settlement, while not perfect, ended the cycle of persecution and allowed most English people to worship without fear. Her careful management of finances kept England solvent through decades of war. Her choice of capable advisors ensured competent government. She proved that a woman could rule successfully in her own right. In an age that believed women were naturally inferior to men, incapable of the rationality and strength required for governance, Elizabeth demonstrated otherwise. She made the decisions herself rather than delegating to male advisors. She commanded armies, directed foreign policy, managed parliament, and ruled her kingdom as effectively as any king. She showed that gender was not the determining factor in leadership ability. More than that, she showed that unmarried female rule was possible. Everyone assumed Elizabeth would marry, that she needed a husband to actually govern while she provided heirs. She refused, understanding that marriage would mean surrendering her power to her husband. By remaining single, she kept control of her government and her kingdom. This was revolutionary. It suggested that women did not need men to define them or to enable them to exercise power. It was a lesson that would not be fully appreciated for centuries, but was nonetheless important. Elizabeth's cultural flowerings in English history. Shakespeare, Marlowe, Spenser, and others produced works during her reign that remain essential to English literature. Theatre thrived, music flourished, architecture reached new heights. This was not accidental. Elizabeth's stability, her patronage of the arts, her creation of a court culture that valued wit and learning, all contributed to an environment where creativity could flourish. The Elizabethan age in literature and drama remains a peak that subsequent ages have admired and tried to emulate. She established England as a naval power and promoted exploration that would lead to empire. The defeat of the Spanish Armada was not just a military victory, but a statement that England could compete with the great European powers at sea. The explorations she sponsored and encouraged, from Drake's circumnavigation to Raleigh's attempts at colonization, laid groundwork for the later British Empire. Elizabeth herself had no clear vision of global empire, but she understood that naval power and overseas trade would benefit England, and she supported those who pursued them. She maintained her independence and England's sovereignty despite enormous pressure to subordinate herself and her kingdom to more powerful states. Philip II of Spain wanted England as a satellite. France wanted to dominate English foreign policy. Catholic Europe wanted Elizabeth to submit to papal authority. Elizabeth resisted all of these pressures, maintaining English independence even when that meant standing alone against powerful enemies. She understood that independence was essential to England's survival and prosperity. Legacy includes costs as well as achievements. Her refusal to name a successor created uncertainty that could have resulted in civil war. She was extraordinarily lucky that the transition to James I proceeded smoothly, but it was luck rather than planning. Her policies in Ireland just brutal, involving scorched earth tactics and mass starvation that left wounds lasting for centuries. Her execution of Mary, Queen of Scots, however politically necessary, set a precedent for subjects judging and executing anointed monarchs. Her religious settlement, while moderate by 16th century standards, still persecuted Catholics and disappointed Puritans. Her decision never to marry meant she had no direct heirs, ending the Tudor dynasty. She sacrificed personal happiness, the possibility of companionship and family, for her kingdom. Whether this sacrifice was necessary or simply the choice of a woman whose childhood traumas made trust and intimacy impossible remains debated.